Holy Thursday or Covenant Thursday or Monday Thursday. It's called Monday Thursday because the word Monday comes from the first two words of the verse from John 13:33, which is Mandate Novo, which is a new covenant I give to you. And that's where the word Monday Thursday comes from. But the church walks us through the journey that walks us through the journey of Christ on this wonderful day, and it does so step by step. And so, I just wanted to kind of go through some of the readings. So on the first, third, sixth, and ninth hours, the first 4 hours of the Holy Thursday, the church deliberately chooses to read the same story from all four Gospels separately, as if to stress its importance. And the story, when you first read it, is a little surprising. It's essentially when Christ asks his disciples, John and Peter, please go prepare for the Passover for me. And he asks them to go, and there they shall find a man who will take them to an upper room, and there they shall prepare the Passover. And it always struck me, why does the church choose to do that for the first, third, sixth, and ninth hour? It seems pretty unremarkable, but we'll kind of go into that a little bit in terms of why it might be the case. The church then proceeds, just like Christ washed the feet of his disciples, we do the la'an, or the lakan service. Lakan means the washing in Coptic. And then subsequently, we participate in Christ's new covenant with us, the Last Supper, through the partaking of the Eucharist. In the 11th hour, it states that he was troubled in the spirit, and that it is when he starts to go into the when he announces that that Judas will betray him, and he says to Judas, "What you have to do, do quickly." In the first hour of the eve of Friday, we read 4 chapters from John 13 to John 17, what is known as the Paraclesis. To the disciples, it's a farewell exposition. To us, it's a love letter. And it's really some of the most beautiful parts of the Holy Bible. And if you ever have the chance to sit down by yourself and read those 4 chapters, I guarantee you'll be moved in the heart. In the third hour, we join Christ as he goes to the garden in the Mount of Olives, and where he prepares for the betrayal. And in the 6th hour is when he has intense prayer and suffering, mental anguish, as he says, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful unto death, and my spirit is willing, but my body is weak." Very, very deep prayer to the Father, asking that this would pass from him, but succumbing to the will of the Father. In the 9th hour is the betrayal of Judas, and in the 11th hour is Peter's denial. If you know me, you would know that I love to talk about love, and I love to talk about God's love in our life. And if it was up to me, I would talk about the Paraclesis, the first 4 chapters. But I think today we don't start there. Today we start off with some of the other readings. Additionally, on the Old Testament side, we have Moses going up to God, asking on behalf of the people of Israel for atonement, and offering himself as an intermediate or a mediator for his people. You see Moses in his struggle at the great battle against the Canaanites to lift his arm so that his people might win. And then lastly, we read about Abraham and Isaac and the sacrifice. When we look at Christ as he's moving through this week of Passion, one of the things that really strikes me is how mindful Christ is of his own death. And it's not just mindfulness, it's heartfulness, in the sense that he fully realizes the implications of what is about to happen. And so it's interesting to me that even when in the first, third, sixth, and ninth hour, when Christ asks his disciples to go and prepare for the Passover, he's preparing for his own death. He's preparing for the journey that's about to happen. And it's really interesting to me that the church takes the time to stress this mindfulness that God has, that Christ has about death. Isaac, in the story of Isaac and Abram, oftentimes we focus on Abram and what was requested of him by God in terms of offering his only son. But if you think back about how old Isaac was, Isaac wasn't young. Abram had Isaac almost at the age of 100. And when this story takes place, Isaac was maybe in his 30s or his 40s or his 50s. He's middle-aged. He's middle-aged. And so Isaac was not innocent in what was happening. He was mindful of what was happening. He carried the wood. A 150-year-old man is not going to carry the wood. He built the altar with his father. He carried the stones. It's not like a 150-year-old man is going to be able to push or force someone upon an altar and tie him. He willingly went on the altar. So Isaac, in all of this, was mindful of what was happening and was able to offer himself despite not fully understanding the implications. So the first thing I want to bring up, the first lesson I want to bring up is that we are all born to die. We are all born to die. We all have an expiration date. And it's important that we are mindful of that in a very serious way. It's one thing to understand it here, it's another thing to understand it here. So Magid Rizk, does that mean that we should just go buy our plot of land, prepare our will? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that in everything that we do, in every way that we approach life, we need to bear in mind this idea that tomorrow I might not live. Christ also was deliberate in his journey. He planned. He completely saw beyond the scope of time how the passion was going to happen, how the death was going to happen, and still succumb to it. And also we should be deliberate in the way we approach death. It's not something that should be feared. It's something that should be thought of and be deliberated. And so when I say deliberate, I mean being serious. Death should be taken very seriously. And it's hard to say that as a 30-year-old, but I bet you it's even harder as a teenager to even think of death in that context. But it's something that, when you hear what happens in the news, when you hear, the tragedies that we hear every day, it's not beyond you. It's not beyond the scope of even the young, that death should be upon them. And so it's important that even in our young age that we take the seriousness of death very, very to heart. In the story of Abraham and Isaac, Abram is asked to submit his only begotten son. Now, you can only imagine living your entire life, 100 years, your first 100 years of life, and you don't have a child. And you, even though you know that God has promised you a child, that when you finally receive that child, this child means the world, everything to you. This child is your legacy. This child is your next generation. This child is everything that matters to you. And yet, Isaac was able to, Abraham or Abram was able to give it up. So in death, even in the context of death, I think there's a lesson here in the sense that Christ asks us to take death seriously, to be mindful of it, and also to be willing to give everything up for it. And so I remember one of my spiritual fathers used to ask me, Magid, what's your Isaac? What is the thing that means so much to you that we have an exceptional time giving it up? It could be your intellect. It could be, your friendships. It could be a relationship. It could be a vice. It could be anything. It could be a friend. It could be a spouse. It could be your child. But what's your Isaac? It's important to know that, because at the end of the day, we are born to die. We are born to die. And at the end of the day, we'll be asked to give up our Isaac. Okay? This is a very morbid talk, but I hope at the end there will be a message that's worth talking about. Lesson number 2. So lesson number 1, we're born to die. We should be mindful of it. We should be deliberate when we approach death, or we should be serious with it, and we should be willing to give up our Isaac. Lesson number 2, we are born to suffer. This is the human condition. This is the human condition. Even in our good times, we suffer, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional, whether it's psychological. We are born to, we are destined for suffering. But it gets even more interesting, because as Christians, we're asked to suffer even more. In 1 Peter chapter 1, St. Peter says, "In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ." So we must suffer, and our faith must be tested. Okay? Abuna Metta Miskin, Father Matthew the Poor, in his book Orthodox Prayer Life, talks about how even in prayer there is suffering. And we see this in the 6th hour of today's Eva Friday reading, when Christ goes to the mount and he prays, and his sweat is like blood, and his soul is deeply troubled. And at first he negotiates with God, his Father, and then he prays that he is willing to accept what the Father would want from him. Abuna Metta Miskin says, "I do not wish to bother the reader with my affairs. Let me suffice it to know that God meant to besiege me with prayer. Whenever physical hunger turned cruel against me, I found my gratification in prayer. Whenever the biting cold of winter was unkind to me, I found my warmth in prayer. Whenever people were harsh to me, and their harshness was severe indeed, I found my comfort in prayer. In short, prayer became my food and my drink, my outfit and my armor, whether by day and by night. This was all the more true in my case, for I had no spiritual father or friend. I had neither a colleague nor a comrade in this journey. The voice of God was the only answer for all my needs. It was the voice of father, friend, comrade, and guide. No sooner did I feel the need for his voice than I heard it speaking inside me, thousands of times stronger than any ear could hear. For what the ear hears, the mind forgets, but what the heart hears, time can never erase." So the human condition is to suffer. The Christian's condition is to suffer and to have their faith tested. And what is the purpose of this? If that is the promise, then why would anyone sign up for that? And I would tell you that because those are the human condition, our God has given us the ability to overcome, and to overcome both now and in the afterlife. I was reading a story, and it was a folk story, kind of this, from the Russian villages. similar to the stories that you hear for Saeed and but it was a cute story, but it really brought home the point of what the last point is, and that in our struggle and in our suffering and in at times our doubt of faith, that our faith is renewed, and with those eyes things change. And so let me just read the story for you, and be patient with me here. And again, it's a story, okay? People are going to tell me, oh, this wasn't true. This isn't theologically accurate. Okay, so death was born on a flaming day. At least that is how she remembered it. She came alive on a day lit up by blazing fire, a fire that came from an immense sword held by an angel. The angel was guarding the door to a place that she, Death, had never seen. At first, Death felt like a stranger, roaming around, feeling lost. Then she saw a beautiful white bird. She stroked the feathers of the bird's back, but as soon as she touched the bird, it fell from her feet, cold and still. That's when Death discovered her terrible power. As the years flowed into eternity, Death traveled with them, touching the animals, the birds, the fish, and the flowers. Death also noticed that there was a different sort of creature, a creature that held in their face a strange reflection of God. The creature was called human. The creature was made in the image of God. Still, the creature called human would become cold and lifeless whenever Death touched it. As the centuries turned into thousands of years, Death claimed all living things for her own. She also learned that all the creatures, the humans, feared her the most. They shrank from her. They tried to pretend she didn't exist. Sometimes Death smiled at the human fear of her, and she enjoyed her power over them. At other times, she wept bitterly because she was lonely and because she sensed that there was something about those human creatures she could not understand. One day, as the story goes, tired and weary, Death sat on a hill between three crosses on which three men were being executed. She did not feel like touching any of these men. She was tired and she was lonely. Suddenly, she heard a voice say, "I thirst." She looked up, and her gaze was met with two fathomless eyes. From their depths flowed a brilliant, warm, blue light, the likes of which she had never experienced before. Instantly, she stood up and walked just a few paces away from the man who hung between the other two. She wanted more than ever to touch him with love and respect, but she dared not do so. Then his eyes called to her in a wordless message. She did not know how it happened, but gently, ever so gently, she touched his cheek. He seemed for an instant to smile at her alone, like those before him. He closed his eyes and became lifeless and cold. She could not believe it. Somehow she knew he was different than the others, so she lingered a while. She saw him taken down from the cross. I'm sorry. She saw his mother hold his lifeless body and cradle him. Ever since I've had children, I've become much more emotional. She saw him being carried off into a grave, out in a cave. Then, as soldiers were about to close the entrance of the cave, Death entered the cave. What passed then, no human will ever know. But one thing is certain. On the following Sunday, 2 days after he had taken down from the cross, some women came to the tomb and found it was empty. Death was not there. And ever since that Sunday, all who look upon Death with the eyes of faith see her differently. They know that love is life, and death is now the gate to eternal life. Glory be to God forever. Amen.